Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. May peace be upon us all. Mr. Wong Kan Seng, Chairman of Singapore Forum Advisory Board, Excellencies Ministers, Ambassadors, and members of the Parliament, distinguished business leaders, ladies and gentlemen. Although I know you must have heard this 1,000 times in recent weeks, let me begin by expressing our deepest condolences about the passing away of the late Lee Kuan Yew. He was not only Singapore's founding fathers, he was a great statesman of Asia. In my country, right after news of his demise, various Indonesian television gave full live coverage about the sad events in Singapore, and some of the coverage lasted until Sunday. I don't remember the last time the Indonesian media gave so much time to the demise of a foreign leader. As Singapore grieved, we in Indonesia too felt that we lost a good friend, a great friend, who among our international friends probably knew Indonesia better than anyone else. His leadership, his energy, and his love for his country were a source of inspiration for all of us. You know, as I traveled from the airport to Shangri-La the day before yesterday, I took a closer look at your island nation, and I saw a modern Singapore, a developed country with a strong national identity. And Lee Kuan Yew's legacy lives in every rock, every tree, every building, and every home in his country. What made the late Lee Kuan Yew special was his foresight and his penetrating understanding of events. On numerous occasions, I had the good fortune to sit with him and listen to his insights and wisdom. He was able to see and position Singapore several steps ahead of the others. And it was this foresight that became so valuable for Singapore to be a country that, despite its size, has continued to punch above its weight in regional and international affairs. I sense it is the search for this foresight and vision that formed the basis for the establishment of the Singapore Forum this year. I welcome and congratulate the launch of the Singapore Forum, and I wish you every success as you to facilitate a meeting point of great minds from Asia and beyond. From reading the agenda, I gather that the main theme of this conference is about Asia and getting a better sense of the future of Asia. For sure, Asia has come a long way to be where we are today. I must admit that there are things that were beyond my imagination when I was a high school teenager or young military officers in the 1960s and 1970s. Back then, no one talked about the Asian century. No one really thought that the strategic and economic weight of the world would shift to Asia. Many thought we were so far behind the West that it would take generations for us to catch up to them. And back then, I did not imagine that China would overtake the United States as the world's largest economy in GDP by purchasing power parity terms, or that India would be the first country to send a spaceship around Mars orbit. I did not imagine that Indonesia would be the world's third largest democracy, or that the world, including my granddaughter Ira, would be dancing to the tunes of Gangnam Style. Yet these are the signs of the times today. You know, my forefathers lived in darkness, and their ambition was quite simple: to be free. Free from colonization, from oppression, and from poverty. Today's generation has much bigger ambitions. They are not only free, they are also free to aspire, to excel, to achieve, and to succeed. Asians today live in momentous time. I am positive that most Asians believe that their future will be better than the present. I share this optimism. I predict that Asia would continue to grow and prosper, and hopefully become more peaceful. I believe that Asian countries will be able to mainstream green growth and sustainable development. But that is not a preordained destination. We need to work hard and stay the course to get there, because, as has happened to other regions, a golden decade can turn into a lost decade in a moment. We therefore need to nurture all the good things that are already brewing in our region and spread them around. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong was right in his remark last night that Asia has a quality of strength and resilience that have enabled its people to defy the odds and prevail. In my view, there are several forces which continue to change the face of Asia for the better. The first is the phenomenal growth of the middle class. We are, I believe, on our way to change a continent of poverty to a continent of wealth. And the middle class is right at the core of this historic process. The middle class is a special type of people. Different countries have different definitions and measurements of who should be counted as middle class. I will not offer you a numerical definition, but I see the middle class is more than people with enough money in the bank and discretionary spending power. People in the middle class usually get there by working hard, which means they have a strong work ethics, which means they tend to value competition and fairness and meritocracy. They are mostly educated with at least one university degree, which means they are informed and make decisions intelligently. They have bank accounts, usually several accounts, and they pay taxes. And because of that, they have a demanding attitude toward the government. They certainly want their government to be competent and clean because they feel they are paying for it. They do not like to be taken for granted, and they want their voices to be heard. They are very conscious of their rights, and they also have the luxury to be more conscientious about the world than, say, the poor. They are usually not satisfied with having good paid tax, for they want a good quality of life for them and their children. And because many of them have investment in many forms, they expect rule of law and legal certainty, and they attach great importance to the security of their hard-won wealth and the security for their family. I would say that the growth of the middle class is arguably the most revolutionary things that can happen to a society. It is revolutionary in terms of its transformational effect to the physical, mental, economic, and political makeup of a society. When the middle class proliferates, you see its powerful impact in many forms, in the rise of cities, in economic growth, in tax revenues, and others. The Asian Development Bank predicted that by 2050, there will be an additional 3 billion people joining the middle class in Asia. Imagine that, 3 billion people. That is several times more than the entire populations of the United States, Canada, and Latin America combined. Those 3 billion new middle class also mean automatically that the poor have been reduced by 3 billion. That is a matter of enormous historical significance for Asia. Closely connected to the rise of the middle class is the second force that I believe will sweep Asia, the rapid spread of entrepreneurship. throughout countries and throughout the region. I know Singaporeans have always been accustomed to entrepreneurship. You had no choice. Your geography, your history, your circumstances as immigrant society, all this forced you to be entrepreneurial from the beginning of your nationhood. But in many countries in Asia, including Indonesia, entrepreneurship was, for a long time, an alien concept. Indeed, some of our cultures were hostile to the growth of entrepreneurship. In some parts of Asia, entrepreneurs were even seen as the scourge of society. Besides, for many generations, the glorious thing to be was, the glorious thing was to be a politician, or warrior soldier, or a civil servant, or a cleric. Perhaps they still do. These are great jobs because I did them, but there is no doubt that in our time, it has become very fashionable to be an entrepreneur, especially among young graduates. Entrepreneurs in our time today are respected, celebrated, and considered cool, hip. And the public likes entrepreneurialism because, unlike the term capitalism, it is dogma-free and ideology-free. It can blossom in a variety of political systems. In Indonesia, many universities now have faculties and studies called entrepreneurship, and new graduates go out to set up businesses that provide jobs instead of applying for one. Many of our national icons are successful entrepreneurs, and there is a growing army of technopreneurs. There is an element of meritocracy about this. Unlike in the past, entrepreneurship no longer has to belong to a certain ethnic group. It can be practiced by anybody, by everybody. I believe that there is a strong correlation between the number of entrepreneurs in a society and its degree of dynamism and progress. Entrepreneurship is important because it signals a shift in the state of mind of a society. It signals can-doism. It signals positive energy. It signals independence and innovation. It reflects confidence and risk-taking. That is why I am convinced that the rapid contingence of entrepreneurialism will be one of the most powerful game changers for Asian economies. The third force that will shape Asia's future is connectivity. In the 20th century, many nations were preoccupied with the issues of sovereignty. But in the 21st century, more and more, the game is about connectivity. It's about how connected you are to the world community, to the world economy, and to the global marketplace of ideas, to the infrastructures that connect the dots. I would not underestimate the power of connectedness. In my country, for centuries, the poor were weak, not just because they lacked economic means, but because they were marginalized, isolated, and disconnected. They felt alone, and therefore they felt helpless and became fatalistic, accepting of their fate. Connectivity changes that. Today, a poor person will feel empowered if he or she feels connected to others. If a person has access to the internet, an email, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other digital things, that person will somehow feel entitled, enabled, and even powerful. This is how young people in the Middle East, many of them poor and unemployed, brought down strong government during the Arab Spring. Today, social media has become the most powerful and ubiquitous tools of democracy and liberty. And politicians ignore the power of social media at their own peril, which is why, as president, I developed a Twitter account which today has grown to some 6.9 million followers. In any case, digital connectivity will spread because Today, most Asians will have the tools in their pockets. Having a mobile phone, a tablet, or Wi-Fi is already a common thing in Asian societies. For those where this has not happened yet, you can be that it will happen soon. And after all, the whole world will be wired in our lifetime. Connectivity in all its dimensions will transform individual, economies, and region. And harnessing connectivity will require better partnership between government and business at local, regional, at local, national, and regional level. In short, whether it is the 2.5 billion mobile phones users in Asia Pacific, or China's maritime Silk Road, or the seaport and pipelines being built in Central and South Asia, or the 80,000-kilometer Trans-Asian Railway, or the ASEAN one-stop online trade system, connectivity will be a critical part of the Asian century that we are all expecting. There are, of course, many more forces driving change in Asia, but I would pick this as my fourth, something that I spent a few decades as President of Indonesia trying to promote regionalism. There is already a lot of nationalisms and plenty of national interest in the diplomatic arena. Yet, I believe peace would be assured if such nationalism is coupled with a healthy dose of regionalism. We must avoid living in a paradox where we profess open regionalism, but at the same time adopt narrow nationalism. Regionalism does not always grow easily. Northeast Asia is still having a difficult time evolving one. Regionalism has also been difficult to take root in South Asia. Even in Europe, there is sensitive debate over how far should European regionalism expand without creating new strategic tensions. Southeast Asia's experience has been a lot better. ASEAN has peacefully expanded from 5 members to 6 and then to 10 members, covering all of Southeast Asia. Next year, come January 1st, we will all formally enter into an ASEAN community. Membership in ASEAN has changed relationship among its member states. We bend more toward one another, and we try harder to find commonalities and work out differences based on neighborliness. Because of regionalism, when we formulate and execute our respective national interests, we are obliged to consider how it will impact our friends in the region. Our ASEAN experience demonstrated that we can evolve both national identity and regional identity at the same time. Regionalism has also delivered good dividends. ASEAN countries have become more secure, more united, and more prosperous because of it. And that is why, in the spirit of deepening ASEAN, as President of Indonesia, I propose the target of doubling GDP and halving poverty for ASEAN 15 years after it becomes a community. I believe that if this healthy regionalism can also be made to grow in other parts of Asia, then the impact on Asia will be far-reaching. The Asian century will have much better prospect. All these forces, the rise of the middle class, the spread of entrepreneurship, the proliferation of connectivity, and the growth of regionalism would fundamentally change Asia. However, for the time being, Asia will need to embrace for some hard winds ahead. We are now feeling the tremors of global seismic shift. I don't think we are returning to the Cold War of the 20th century, but it looks like we have to embrace ourselves for a future marked by more turbulence and a greater sense of uncertainty. The strategic stability and cooperation between the major powers that began after the collapse of the Berlin Wall has begun to crack. The relation between US and Russia is now marked by mutual suspicion and tension, and so is the relation between Europe and Russia, triggered by the conflict in Ukraine. China and Japan have been engaged in a nasty row over the Senkaku, and although the situation today is less tense than before, it is still not yet fully normalized. In the South China Sea, the reclamation effort by the Chinese are again raising the stakes in that hotspot. There are signs of improvement in Sino-American relations, but the element of rivalry and competition between Washington and Beijing remain obvious. History has repeatedly proved that what happens among the major powers, one way or another, will impact on our national well-being and regional stability. If their relations are positive and cooperative, then we can achieve many good things. We saw the six powers work on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. We saw nations large, medium, and small collaborating during the tsunami of 2004. We saw them working together in the G20 to save the world economy from global economic crisis. But if the relation between the major powers take a downturn, then peace becomes even more elusive. It would make it much more difficult to resolve the conflict in the Ukraine or in Syria. Yet despite the downturn, there are also opportunities. We see cross-strait relations between Beijing and Chinese Taipei improving significantly. China's relations with South Korea have also become warmer. We are also encouraged by the long-awaited breakthrough in the nuclear negotiation between Iran and the six powers, although we have to wait until June for the deal to be finalized. And it is a good sign that France, Germany, and Italy are reportedly signing up to the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, which is led by China. Their decision to join is a good thing, as it shows an opportunity-driven, forward-looking, pragmatic attitude in European countries' attitude toward China. We all hope that the AIIB will grow and become complementary to the work of the IMF and the World Bank. Similarly, we also expect that the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, will evolve in synergy with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And of course, the common thread emanating from ICES should also provide an incentive for countries to work together and perhaps catalyze some change or dynamics in the Syrian conflict. In my view, ISIS is a hybrid threat. It is not just a terrorist organization, even though it uses the same tactics as a terror group. Defeating ISIS will require more than military measures alone. We will need a combination of military, political, social, and informational approach. We will need greater global and regional collaboration. So the opportunities are there. They just have to be seized and harnessed. I believe despite our respective national interests, we all have an abiding interest in seeing a stable, cooperative, and positive relation among major powers. I agree President Xi Jinping's call during his meeting with President Barack Obama in Sunnyland, California in 2013, where he spoke of a need for a new model of great powers relation. I believe President Barack Obama, too, was receptive to this notion. And why not? He has proved that he could think outside the box and not married to the past by re-establishing ties with Cuba, a daring move in the context of American politics. Indeed, any durable and peaceful 21st century world order would much depend on how much we can deviate from the unhealthy zero-sum mindset of the 19th and 20th century, where power shifts were always accompanied by new conflict and even war. We need to find a new path forward. I would call this agenda as ushering in the geopolitics of cooperation, where powers large, medium, and small interact on the basis of their commonalities rather than differences, with a forward-looking mindset leaving behind the zero-sum game in favor of win-win approach. You know, I actually do not mind to see major powers and all powers compete in our region, so long as they compete for peace, for economic progress, and for common prosperity. This means we welcome for them not to repel one another, but to compete in our region in positive way to spread their soft powers, to do more trade, more investment, more educational exchanges, more tourists, and more technology transfer. The more they do this, the more our region will benefit, the more everybody wins, and the more we have durable peace. To promote geopolitics of cooperation, we need to close the widening trust deficit and develop strategic trust between nations. Strategic trust does not develop overnight. They grow from time-consuming effort, from countless meetings and talks, and from the experience of working together, which leads to mutual understanding. They involve a lengthy give and take process and a constant demonstration of goodwill. Strategic trust grows from sustained guidance-building measures, I should say confidence-building measures, and success in managing or resolving conflicts. Once we achieve such strategic trust, we need to keep earning it because trust can fade after a while. And even in the wake of rising nationalism, leaders still have to spend their political capital to develop and maintain strategic trust. Remember, good leaders can harness positive nationalism, while bad leaders stoke narrow nationalism. The effort to develop strategic trust have been central to the conduct of Indonesia's foreign policy in the past decade. For Indonesia, it is critical that we do not get pulled one way or another into the web of geostrategic tension. We have our own national interests, which oblige us to always maintain our independence in the midst of power shift. However, rather than keeping a distance from the major powers, we have done just the opposite. We have embraced them even closer. Within the last decade, Indonesia has developed strategic or comprehensive partnership with all the major powers, with the United States, with China, with Japan, with Russia. And at the same time, we have also intensified relations with emerging powers of the world, India, Turkey, South Africa, South Korea, and others. Indonesia also believes that Southeast Asian countries must do all we can to keep our region as coherent geopolitical and geoeconomic unit. Southeast Asia must become a healthy labyrinth of bilateral, trilateral, and regional cooperation for the countries in the region. This is more than just a romantic notion about an ASEAN family. It is a strategic imperative to keep ASEAN centrality and our collective well-being in an increasingly turbulent world. Like Singapore, Indonesia has a lot riding of the success of ASEAN. In the 10 years that I served as President of Indonesia, I can tell you that the regional peace, stability, and cooperation provided by ASEAN has significantly contributed to our effort to transform Indonesia and to be where we are today. Yes, we still have plenty of problems, shortcomings, even setbacks. But there is no doubt that Indonesia's progress has been substantive and real. You may well remember the time around 1998 when many predicted that Indonesia would become a failed state with an economy that was collapsing, riots in the street, and bloody conflict. But with hard work, we reversed course. And 10 years later, in 2008, Indonesia became a G20 economy, and then the second highest growth economy among the G20 after China. Today, our democracy is still a work in progress. We are facing an uphill struggle to maintain relatively high economic growth. We are doing our best to maintain the moderate nature of our Islamic Ummah so they can be a force for harmony, tolerance, and peace. I am pleased that Indonesia can prove that democracy, Islam, and modernity can live together. We have also demonstrated that democracy and development can also progress together. We don't have to choose between them. In my view, there are two challenges for all Indonesian leaders today and tomorrow. First is to maintain and even accelerate what Indonesia has achieved so far for a better future. We have to continue our reforms. Second, Indonesia must continue to exercise a positive role and responsibility to foster peace, stability, and progress in the region. I am utterly convinced that Indonesia is a key part of the vision of a dynamic, peaceful, prosperous Asia that we are aiming for. Together, we must continue to work together to reach our common future and shared prosperity. We must continue to grow our middle class, promote entrepreneurships, expand connectivity, and strengthen regionalism. We must continue to evolve the architecture for cooperation that would nurture strategic trust among all other stakeholders. We must never tire to develop confidence building and press on with our effort to resolve ongoing as well as potential conflict. We must see to it that future generations, especially future leaders, embrace cultures of peace and positive nationalism. We must make sure that the ASEAN community become genuinely people-centered and a force for progress that will continue to transform Asia. If we get the geopolitics and geoeconomics right, there is every possibility that the 21st century shall be Asia's best century. Let us seize this moment together. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yudhoyono. Thank you so much.